You've probably heard of Plan 1919 as JFC Fuller's proposal to win the war, the Great War, in the spring of 1919. But there was actually a Plan 1918. Moreover, Fuller had a proposal in January 1918 for a decisive operation in spring 1919, which precedes the document we commonly know as Plan 1919. In other words, the first Plan 1919 is not the document that JFC Fuller and historians have pushed as Plan 1919, but it was still a plan for a decisive operation in spring of 1919. There are actually several Plan 1919s. After Fuller wrote his first Plan 1919, first effective Plan 1919, in January 1918, this is before the document he later identified as Plan 1919, there was another proposal by Stephen Foote, a colleague from the Tank Corps who had worked with JFC Fuller in France, but was now at the War Office in London. Probably inspired by some of Fuller's writings, Stephen Foote came up with a Plan 1919. In other words, another proposal to win the war in March of 1919 with mainly tanks and other variants, equipping an effectively fully mechanized assault force. It was after Foote's Plan 1919 that Fuller wrote what I am categorizing as his second Plan 1919, and this is the one that gets accepted by his higher commanders and gets nicknamed Plan 1919. That particular Plan 1919 is dated by Fuller himself to May 1918. That is 4 months after the document I have discovered as his first Plan 1919. So let's talk about what I have identified as Fuller's Plan 1918. This dates to the summer of 1917, during the long build-up and longer execution of what is known inaccurately as the Battle of Passchendaele, which lasted all of summer 1917 and into the autumn and even into the winter. Tank Corps HQ was sensibly working on doctrines and plans for more effective battles. This was the period, summer 1917, in which Fuller first proposed a decisive offensive in the following spring. That would be the spring of 1918, which is why I have identified this plan as Plan 1918. At the same time, by the way, he was proposing a surprise attack on Cambrai in 1917 and also tank raids in 1917, all of which would influence the offensive at Cambrai in November 1917. It's the most successful tank or combined arms attack to date. So the origins of Plan 1918. On the 10th of June 1917, 3 days after the start of the offensive against Messines Ridge, Fuller started a new doctrinal paper entitled Projected Bases for the Tactical Employment of Tanks in 1918. The first two words capture the paper's focus on sustainment, inspired by the use of supply tanks for the first time 3 days earlier. He later repudiated what he called its, quote, hideous title, end quote. The title certainly underestimates the document's scope. An addition to the document, dated 8th of August, is annotated as The Tactical Employment of Tanks 1918. It contains most of the estimates, ambitions, and requirements that made famous his plan, later, for a decisive offensive in spring 1919, which became known for short as Plan 1919. Thus, the paper of June 1917 should be known for short as Plan 1918. Plan 1918 is wrapped up with his plans for tank raids, as he called them, and an operation at Cambrai, which wasn't meant to be decisive, but was meant to cause a lot of casualties to the Germans in an area they weren't expecting an attack. That operation at Cambrai eventually goes ahead on the 20th of November. Within an hour of the assault starting, Fuller restarted his planning for a decisive operation. In his memoir, he says this: I sat in the GS office, General Staff Office, gazing at the oiled calico. I was not in the slightest anxious or nervous, for I was certain that the initial attack would be a walkover. Nothing but an act of God could prevent this. I was certain also that the battle would be a limited, and in no strategical sense of the word, a decisive one, unless another such act were to intervene. As for an hour or two I had nothing to do, I jotted down some notes for a study I had in my head on the use of tanks in 1918 and 1919. End quote. The fight for the salient towards Cambrai and the recriminations over its failed sustainment continued into December 1917. Tank delivery schedules were postponed so far into the future that no combined arms Allied offensive seemed possible until summer 1918. On the 14th of December, the British Expeditionary Force General Headquarters issued instructions to switch to the defensive, accompanied by a paper entitled Memorandum on Defensive Measures. Those defensive measures, indeed, continued for months, and by the time the British were just about thinking about another offensive operation with tanks, they were hit by the German counteroffensive in March 1918, which took months to settle. Now, during that time, actually on the 28th of January, Fuller submitted a new paper entitled Tank Operations Decisive and Preparatory, 1918 to 1919. This proposes a decisive combined arms offensive in 1919 after a series of combined arms raids in 1918. The paper foreshadows Fuller's proposal of May 1918 for a similarly configured and scaled offensive in spring 1919, which became known as Plan 1919. His paper of January, the 28th of January, should be known as his first Plan 1919, even though he himself and subsequent historians ignored the link. The first Plan 1919, as I have identified it, the one dated to January 1918, contained most of the elements that we know from Plan 1919, the emphasis on good terrain, the emphasis on concentration, with a huge force, an unprecedented force of tanks and other tracked vehicles to carry a mostly mechanized force. Surprise, infiltration by a subforce of tanks. At night, at least 8,000 yards through the enemy lines and to the flanks, carrying medium machine gunners who would dig in defensively to prevent enemy reinforcements from reaching the front during the main assault. This foreshadows the ambition of his second Plan 19, i.e. the one he himself called Plan 1919, to pass medium tanks through enemy lines in order to attack enemy HQs before even the main assault gets going. In both documents, Fuller does not explain how tanks are supposed to pass through an unassaulted front, except in the first document to imply that darkness and improved mobility would be sufficient for Mark V heavier tanks. Commonalities between the two Plan 1919s, the emphasis on combined arms assaults, including engineers, high mobility, the phrases quick initiative and quick movement, and of course sustainment of the advance, sustainment of both the occupation of the objectives and sustainment of the further advance from those initial objectives. However, another quirk is that this paper, the first Plan 1919, as well as the second Plan 1919, are remarkably inattentive to exploitation, perhaps because Fuller was already thinking that medium tanks could infiltrate the enemy's front before the main assault and then act as exploiters concurrently with the main assault, without the need for tanks rolled as exploiters alone. As I mentioned, Major Stephen Foote came up with his own Plan 1919, although it was never known as such. From February 1918, Stephen Foote, formerly a tank brigade major in France, was now serving as a general staff officer at the Directorate General Tank Corps in the War Office, where he detailed the Tank Corps' requirements for authorization by the War Office and for fulfillment by the Ministry of Munitions. DGTC's work was interrupted by the German offensive in March 1918, when the priority was to restructure the tank corps in France to meet the onslaught, including as pedestrian machine gunners. By April, the ministry's periodical forecast of production confirmed that insufficient tanks would be available for a decisive offensive until spring 1919. German counteroffensives continued through April. Indeed, the last would not be officially terminated until 29th of April 1918, although by then the Allies were planning for their own offensive to take advantage of German overstretch. On 24th of April, Foote added a document titled A Mobile Army, which proposes suitable terrain, concentration, surprise, combined arms, speed, sustainment, and exploitation for an offensive around May 1919. Foote and Fuller never clarified how their proposals influenced each other. In June 1917, Fuller had proposed a decisive offensive in spring 1918, although in smaller scale, Fuller proposed an assault front of 20 miles, still 5 miles longer than anything the BEF had yet achieved. He required 750 light tanks to exploit it. Foote might not have seen Fuller's proposal of June 1917, that is what I have termed his Plan 1918, but must have heard about it while administering central workshops in France. February was the month when Fuller realized that current light and medium tanks could not satisfy his doctrine. So began the long but poorly documented and poorly told genesis of his most famous doctrinal paper, which he liked to publicize as Plan 1919, but which I have identified as his second Plan 1919. The second document was not finished until late May. Fuller concluded on the 24th of May 1918 by promising, quote, every prospect of ending the war in May 1919. Plan 1919 was viable, except for Fuller's vague hope that medium tanks could infiltrate the enemy's front before the assault, which the General Staff properly finessed in July 1918 by conflating the assault and disorganizing phases. Unfortunately, most historians of Plan 1919 never read it. They preferred to consult Basil Littleheart after the Second World War more than Fuller, who was discredited by a longer period of advocacy for fascism. Even historians too young to have met either man tend to be students of Littleheart's mentees. Further, they tend to be anchored in Littleheart's imperative to, quote, counter the orthodoxy. Most lack the military experience to interpret Fuller's sketchy papers and the official discourse. I had the privilege to revisit Plan 1919 in Fuller's own diary, in which he pasted copies of some of his original writings from the Great War, and I thank the Tank Museum for the access.